Zariah Monroe stood still at the edge of the iron school gates, her breath steady but shallow. The morning sun draped its golden warmth over Crestwood Academy, but the tight knot in her stomach didn't budge. She had visited the school once, for the scholarship interview, but today it felt different. More imposing, more watchful. Crestwood looked like the kind of place that demanded perfection. The lawn was freshly trimmed, the bricks washed clean, and the students walking past wore sweaters bearing the school's crest like a badge of honor. Zariah adjusted her bag on her shoulder, quietly pulling her locks into a tighter bun. She had spent 2 hours perfecting her hair the night before, oiling and twisting each lock with care. It wasn't just a hairstyle, it was part of her identity, woven with memory and pride. Her mother had kissed her forehead that morning, her voice firm but warm. "Hold your head high, baby. Your hair is your crown, and your mind is your power. Never let them take either from you." Words that sounded brave in the kitchen, but now echoed with vulnerability in the halls of this new world. Zariah had grown up in a house where hair was celebrated. Her mother ran a home salon for black women in their neighborhood, where the kitchen turned into a sanctuary every weekend. There was laughter, music, and the scent of shea butter. Her grandmother, a retired civil rights teacher, often sat nearby, telling stories about women who marched in protest with their afros high and their voices louder. Zariah learned early on that her hair was never just hair. It was history, pride, resistance. But here, at Crestwood, her crown felt exposed. On her first day, the silence was louder than any insult. Students looked twice but said nothing. Teachers smiled but only halfway. At lunch, she sat alone. No one told her where to sit, but somehow the message was clear. Zariah wasn't unfamiliar with being the only black girl in a room, but at Crestwood, the isolation carried a different weight. It wasn't just loneliness. It was quiet judgment. By the second week, whispers followed her in the hallway. A group of girls walked behind her, giggling. She heard one say, "It looks like she has ropes hanging off her head." The others laughed, just loud enough for Zariah to hear. She kept walking. She always kept walking. Then came the incident in history class. She raised her hand to answer a question about the Civil War. She knew the answer. She had read ahead, studied harder. Mr. Dalton looked her way, hesitated, and then called on someone who guessed wrong. He didn't look at Zariah again. She lowered her hand slowly, pretending not to notice the boy beside her smirking. Later that day, she opened her locker to find a folded piece of paper, a cartoon drawing, a stick figure with oversized lips, wild hair scribbled in black, and a crown falling off its head. Below it, someone had written in pencil, "Jungle Queen." Her throat tightened. She looked around. No one stood near. She folded the paper in half, then again, and shoved it deep into her backpack. She didn't cry. She didn't tell anyone. On Thursday, she was called to the office. Principal Rowley sat across from her, expression unreadable. "There's been a complaint," she said. "Several students have found your hairstyle distracting in the classroom." Zariah stared. Her locks were tied neatly, no colors, no beads, just natural, clean, and respectful. "Can you tell me what part of my hair is distracting?" she asked, voice even but tired. Rowley sighed. "It's not personal. We just have to maintain an environment that's uniform and appropriate for all students. We're asking for conformity. That's all." That word, conformity, cut deeper than any insult. Zariah walked home that day in silence. Her shadow stretched long behind her, and each step felt heavier than the last. She knew this wasn't just about hair. It was about being too visible, too different, too unapologetic. And yet all she'd done was exist. Her grandmother sat on the porch as usual, shelling peas in a big silver bowl. The smell of jasmine hung in the air. "They called my hair distracting," Zariah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her grandmother didn't look up. "They've been saying that since I was your age," she replied. "Doesn't mean—" "They were right then, and it sure don't make them right now." Zariah sat beside her, watching the peas drop into the bowl one by one. "It's not just the hair, Grandma. It's everything. The way they look at me. The way the teachers ignore me. I don't even know why I'm here. Her grandmother set the bowl aside and turned to her. You're here because you earned your place. You're here because your voice belongs in every room, even the ones that try to silence you. Zariah nodded slowly. But inside, something was crumbling. She felt like a guest in her own story, a shadow in someone else's spotlight. That night she stood in front of her mirror with her locks down. They fell past her shoulders in thick, elegant strands. She touched one gently, remembering the hours her mother spent twisting each one, the way her hands moved with care, with love. Maybe they wanted her to feel small. Maybe they thought silence would make her disappear. But Zariah wasn't just a girl with hair. She was a girl with history carried in every strand. She stared at her reflection, not blinking. If they want conformity, she thought, they're not going to get it from me. She pulled her locks back, tied them high like a crown, and whispered to herself, let them stare. She didn't know that in just days, something unimaginable would happen, something cruel and humiliating. She didn't yet know the pain that would come or the strength she'd have to find. But in that moment, under the quiet hum of her bedroom, Light Zariah made a promise she didn't need to speak aloud. They could mock her, they could try to erase her, but she wasn't going anywhere. Zariah walked into Crestwood Academy with her head held high, but her stomach twisted into knots. She had done everything right that morning, pressed her uniform, checked her bag twice, tied her locks in a neat bun, but still, the unease clung to her like fog. She had learned long ago that sometimes, just walking into a room was enough to make her a target, especially here, where polished floors and whispered traditions walked, hand in hand with quiet prejudice. She'd been placed in a group with Madison, Claire, and Harper, 3 white girls who ruled the social hallways of Crestwood like they owned the blueprint. Their laughs were always just a little too loud, their glances just sharp enough to sting, and their smiles so perfectly measured they felt cold. Zariah wasn't surprised when they barely acknowledged her during the first meeting. They had already assigned themselves the important parts of the project. Without asking, they gave her the title slide and told her to make it cute. That night, Zariah went home and rewrote the entire presentation. She stayed up researching, cross-referencing, and organizing the information, pulling quotes from speeches her grandmother had once taught her to memorize. She didn't do it to impress them. She did it because she respected the people in those slides, because she respected herself. The next day, she brought her USB with quiet pride, but when she offered to share it, Harper laughed and said, "Oh, we're already done, but you can show us yours if you want." The words were dipped in politeness, but they sliced just the same. Zariah said nothing. She sat beside them as they rehearsed a script she had never seen, and she forced herself to stay composed while her work was ignored. Things got worse the following day. Claire leaned toward her and whispered, "Do you ever get headaches from your hair being so heavy?" Zariah blinked. She wasn't sure how to respond. Madison added, "It must be so much work. Like, how do you even sleep with all that?" Harper giggled. "Imagine having that on your head every day. I'd cry." Zariah felt the heat rise to her cheeks. She clenched her fists beneath the desk. Her mother had always told her, "There's power in knowing when to speak and when to be still." So she said nothing. But stillness came with a cost. On the third day, the cruelty took a new shape. Mr. Dalton stepped out to take a phone call. The classroom buzzed with low conversation. Madison turned in her chair and stared at Zariah. "You know," she said loudly, "I read that if you don't wash your hair right, stuff grows in it, like actual mold." Harper gasped dramatically. Claire fake gagged. Laughter rippled through. Few rose. Zariah closed her eyes. She breathed slowly, trying to will herself invisible. But then she heard the scrape of a chair, the click of something metallic. When she opened her eyes, Madison was standing in front of her, holding a pair of scissors. "Don't worry," she smiled. "I just want to see what it feels like." Zariah jerked backward, too late. A sharp snip filled the air. A thick lock fell into Madison's palm, and the world fell silent. Zariah froze. Her mind went blank. Around her, the classroom shifted from laughter to stunned quiet. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "Did she just—" Madison held up the Loc like it was a trophy. "It's like rope," she said, twisting it in her fingers. "Weird, right?" Zariah stared at the strand of hair lying on the desk. Her throat tightened. That wasn't just hair. It was her history. It was hours of care, years of growth, stories braided in by her mother's hands. And now it was on. The desk, severed, mocked and meaningless in the eyes of the people who'd taken it. She stood slowly, the chair legs scraping the floor. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just walked out. No one stopped her. The hallway felt colder than usual. Her feet carried her down the corridor to the nearest restroom. She locked herself in the farthest stall and leaned against the wall, her breath uneven. Her hand went to the side of her head where the lock had been cut. It felt raw, exposed. Her heart ached with a pain deeper than anything she had words for. It wasn't just the humiliation. It was the silence, the permission, the message that no one in that room had thought she mattered enough to protect. Eventually, she gathered herself, walked to the nurse's office, and asked to call her mother. When her mother arrived, she didn't ask what happened. She saw it on Zariah's face, the way her shoulders curled inward, the missing strand, the quiet defeat in her eyes. They walked together to the main office, where Principal Rowley and Mr. Dalton were waiting. Madison sat beside her mother, arms crossed, like she was bored. Claire and Harper sat in the back, suddenly quiet. Zariah sat down, still saying nothing. Her mother, on the other hand, was composed, but burning. "I'd like to know," she began, "why my daughter's hair was cut in a classroom under your supervision." Mr. Dalton cleared his throat. "I had stepped out for just a moment. I didn't witness the incident myself. But you came back. And what did you do when you saw a child holding a piece of someone else's hair?" Rowley cut in. "Let's remember, this may have been a case of poor judgment. Teenagers sometimes act without thinking." Madison's mother spoke next. "It was just a joke," she was curious. "Let's not make this into something it's not." Zariah's mother turned to her. "And Madison didn't apologize?" Madison shrugged. "It'll grow back." That was when Zariah finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but firm. "It's not just hair." The room fell silent. Rowley shifted. "We understand it was hurtful, but we also don't want to permanently damage Madison's academic record. A written apology and a short suspension would be fair." Zariah looked at her mother. Then back at Rowley. "Fair," she repeated, the word like ash in her mouth. That night at home, her mother gently retwisted the damaged section. Her hands moved slowly, carefully. Zariah sat still, eyes forward. The comb didn't tug hard, but it still brought tears, not from pain, but from memory. Her grandmother watched from the hallway, arms folded, face lined with something deeper than anger. "They always want us to forgive," she said, her voice soft and steady, "even when they don't ask for it, even when they never stop to understand what they've taken." Zariah didn't reply. She didn't have words for what she was feeling. She only knew that something inside her had shifted, like a crack that had spread too far to ignore. The next morning, Zariah stayed in bed longer than usual. Her alarm rang twice before she turned it off. The thought of walking back into that room felt unbearable. She had always known that being different came with challenges, but she had never imagined it would be this violent, this personal. Her mother knocked once before entering. She sat at the edge of the bed and ran her fingers gently across Zariah's blanket. "You don't have to say anything," she said softly, "but I need you to hear something." Zariah turned her face toward the wall. "I know this hurts, and I can't take that pain away, but what happened to you wasn't your fault. It wasn't about your hair. It was about their ignorance, their hate. And if you let this moment shrink you, they win." Zariah's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, but the words were caught behind emotion. Later that day, she went downstairs and found her grandmother at the kitchen table, sorting through old photographs. She looked up and gave Zariah a small smile. "I thought you might want to see this," she said, sliding a black and white photo across the table. It showed a young girl with an afro standing at a protest line, holding a cardboard sign that read, "I am not my hair, but I am not yours to touch either." Zariah stared at the photo, her eyes stinging. "That's me," her grandmother said. 15, right before I was shoved off that sidewalk by a man twice my size. Zariah looked stunned. Her grandmother nodded. "You think this fight is new, baby? This fight is old. But every time we speak, every time we stand, we push it forward, even if just a little." That night, Zariah sat in her room, journaling for the first time in months. Her words came slowly at first, then in a rush. She wrote about the classroom, the scissors, the silence. She wrote about how her heart felt like it had cracked open and something new was trying to grow. The next day, she returned to school. She didn't sit with Madison, Claire, or Harper. She sat alone. But for the first time, she didn't feel alone. She carried her grandmother's photo in her notebook. She carried her mother's strength in her spine. And she carried herself differently, shoulders back, eyes forward. Madison passed her in the hallway but said nothing. Claire looked away. Harper pretended not to see her. Zariah walked past them like smoke. Later that week, Ms. Sanchez, the art teacher, pulled her aside after class. "I heard what happened," she said, "and I want you to know. I see you. And I admire your strength." Zariah didn't know what to say. No one had said anything kind in days. The words hit her like a warm wind. "Have you ever thought of putting what you're feeling into something visual?" Ms. Sanchez asked. "Sometimes art helps where words fail." Zariah nodded slowly. Maybe it was time to turn the pain into something new, something hers. Over the weekend, Zariah stayed in her room with pencils, markers, and paint. She didn't have a canvas, so she used the back of an old science fair board. Her hands moved. With a mix of anger and purpose, she drew her face, half in shadows, half in light. Her hair, full and bold, stretched upward like branches. But in one corner she drew a hand with scissors, and the locket had severed. In bold letters she painted beneath it, "Not yours to cut." On Monday she carried the board into school. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't care if it was against dress code or school decorum. During free period, she hung it on the wall outside the library. By lunch, students were stopping to stare. Some asked questions. Some nodded in silent understanding. Ms. Sanchez found her in the hallway. "You've started something," she said. Zariah smiled just a little. That night, she walked past the mirror in her hallway. For the first time in days, she stopped. She looked at her reflection. And this time, she didn't flinch. She saw her strength again. She walked. Zariah didn't return to school the next day, or the day after. The sound of her alarm clock no longer pulled her from bed. Instead, she let it ring, then fade, like an echo she couldn't reach. She didn't eat breakfast. She didn't answer messages. She didn't open her laptop. Her bedroom became her entire world, a small, silent space where no one could see her, touch her, or ask her to be strong. Her mirror was covered now, draped with a towel she hadn't moved in days. She couldn't look at herself. Every time she passed her reflection, it felt like staring into someone else's eyes. Someone broken, someone smaller, someone who had lost something they couldn't name. Before, her hair had made her proud. It had made her feel grounded. Now it felt like a reminder of everything she wanted to forget. Every time she reached up and touched the uneven patch, the memory came back like a punch. The laughter, the scissors, the silence. Her mother knocked softly on the door every morning. She never pushed it open. She just stood there waiting. "Zariah, baby. I made oatmeal. Just a little," she'd say. "Come out whenever you're ready." But Zariah never moved. She heard the pain in her mother's voice, the kind that tried to hide itself behind warmth, and it made her chest ache even more. Her grandmother, on the other hand, didn't believe in waiting. She came in on the third day, sat down beside Zariah on the bed, and stared at her with the fire that had once faced down police barricades. "They want you quiet," she said. "They want you ashamed. That's how they win. You gonna let them win? Zariah didn't respond. She couldn't. Her voice felt buried beneath the weight of everything she was carrying. She hadn't cried, not fully, but the tears clung to the corners of her eyes like they were afraid to fall. Her grandmother stood. Then cry, or scream, or write. But don't sit here letting this eat you. That night she picked up an old notebook. The pages were bent, the cover faded. It had once been her sketch journal filled with doodles and dreams. Now she turned to a blank page and just stared. Her hand moved slowly, the pen trembling as she wrote. They took more than my hair. It was the first sentence. She kept going. They took my voice, my peace, my pride. And nobody stopped them. The words poured out like a dam had broken. She wrote about the classroom, the laughter, the way everyone looked away, the teacher who didn't ask questions, the principal who wanted it to be a learning experience. She wrote about how small she felt, how humiliated, how tired. She wrote until her fingers cramped. When she finally looked up, it was past midnight. Her eyes burned, but for the first time in days, she felt a breath of air move through her chest. Not peace, not healing, but the beginning of something, and that was enough to try again the next day. But the world outside her room didn't pause. Her absence from school didn't make headlines. It didn't cause outrage. It barely caused a ripple. No calls came from the principal, no messages from teachers. Not even a single classmate reached out. Not to check on her, not to apologize, not to say they saw what happened. Instead, her phone screen filled with screenshots. Someone had taken a photo the day it happened. The image of Madison holding up the severed Loc, grinning, had been turned into a meme. Text slapped across it like a joke. Jungle wins best hair, in biology. Zariah's hand trembled as she scrolled through the comments. Chill, it's just a joke. She's overreacting. It's not that deep. Hair grows back, some laughed, others liked the post. A few even reposted it with new captions. Not one of them thought to ask how she felt. Not one of them called out the cruelty. She turned off her phone and shoved it in a drawer. The silence hurt, but the noise hurt more. The next day, her grandmother returned with a stack of old newspaper clippings. These, she said, are from when I had to cut my afro to get a job. Said it was too militant. Said it made white customers uncomfortable. She laid them out across the bed, photos of black women in picket lines, articles quoting school board officials banning cornrows, headlines about students being suspended. Over Locs, Zariah looked down at the articles. Some were yellow with age, some were recent. They've always feared what they don't understand, her grandmother said. But they especially fear a black girl who loves herself loudly. Zariah traced one clipping with her finger. Sometimes, she whispered, I wish I didn't have to fight just to exist. Her grandmother sat beside her. I know, baby, I wish that too. But we don't fight because we want to. We fight because if we don't, they win again and again. And you're too powerful to let them win. Zariah nodded slowly. But her heart still ached. Not everything could be fixed with wisdom. Some wounds needed time. Some needed voice. Later that evening, Zariah stood in the bathroom, scissors in hand. She hadn't told anyone. She didn't even plan to. But something inside her pushed her there. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the weight. Maybe it was the feeling that if she couldn't control anything else, at least she could control this. She looked into the mirror for the first time in days. Her eyes were swollen, her skin dull, her shoulders slumped. But it was her hair, uneven, wounded, that she couldn't look away from. She lifted the scissors. Her hand trembled. She pictured Madison's face, the way she laughed, the way she held Zariah's lock like it was nothing. And then she pictured herself, sitting in that chair, frozen, humiliated, erased. Her breath hitched. She lowered the scissors. No, she whispered to her reflection. Not like this. She dropped the scissors into the sink and backed away. Her knees gave out, and she sat on the floor, crying in full for the first time. Not because she was weak, but because she finally knew she wasn't. The next morning, she Woke up feeling something she hadn't in a long time. Not peace, but possibility. She reached for her journal and began to write again. Not about pain this time, but about truth. Her truth. The parts they couldn't erase, the parts they didn't understand. She wrote about her mother's hands braiding her hair while humming old church songs. She wrote about the time her grandmother told her that her hair grew toward the sun because it was born from light. She wrote about the feeling of standing in front of a classroom and knowing an answer no one else did. She wrote about laughter with friends who made her feel seen. Each sentence rebuilt her. Each page reminded her who she was. At breakfast, she sat with her mother for the first time in days. "I don't want to be angry forever," she said quietly. Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Then don't. Be loud, be brilliant, be you." Zariah nodded. She wasn't whole yet, but she was healing. By the end of the week, Zariah stepped outside for the first time. It was just the front porch. Just for a few minutes. But the breeze touched her skin in a way that made her close her eyes and breathe deeper. The sun warmed her shoulders. For the first time, the outside didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an invitation. Her neighbor, Mrs. Ellis, waved from across the street. "Missed seeing your smile, baby." Zariah offered a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was honest. Inside, she helped her mother fold laundry, helped her grandmother clip basil from the garden. She started brushing her locks again, slowly working through the tangles. She didn't hide the uneven part anymore. She didn't scroll. Social media. Didn't need to see who was mocking her or forgetting her. The only thing she needed to remember was this. She was still here, scarred, changed, but here. That had to count for something. That had to be enough. For now. The following. Monday, Zariah asked her mother for paint. "Paint?" She repeated, surprised. Zariah nodded. "I want to make something." She didn't know exactly what yet, but she knew it had to come out. The feelings, the memories, the fire still burning inside her. She took cardboard from the garage, old, brushes from a drawer, and sat in the backyard. She started with a background, deep red and bright gold. She added the outline of a girl. Then hair. Bold, wide, unapologetic locks rising like flames into the sky. In the corner, she painted scissors. Not because she wanted to remember, but because forgetting would never make it right. She painted a mirror cracked down the middle. Then a hand reaching through the shards. Her mother came out to check on her. She didn't interrupt, just stood behind her daughter, hand pressed to her heart. "You're telling your story," she said. Zariah nodded, not looking away from the canvas. "I'm not finished yet," she replied, and she meant it. Later that night, Zariah opened her journal one last time. She flipped past pages filled with pain, past moments of despair, past the scrawled sentences that once carried her anger, and she began a new page. "I am not what they tried to take," she wrote. "I am what I choose to rebuild." The next morning, she put on her uniform. She adjusted her bun. She didn't hide the uneven strand. She left it there, visible, a scar and a symbol. Her grandmother looked at her and smiled with pride. "You ready?" she asked. Zariah took a breath. "Not completely," she said. "But I'm going anyway." They drove to school in silence. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was strong. This one was steady. This one carried the sound of a girl who had walked through fire and was still standing. When they pulled into the parking lot, students watched from a distance. Some whispered, some looked away. Zariah walked past them, not fast, not afraid. She walked like someone who had learned to carry her truth, even when it burned. And though her voice had once been stolen, she now held it close, ready to use it again, because healing wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady. It was slow. It was hers. She walked. Behind every quiet breath she took, there was a roar building. It wasn't time to scream yet. But it was coming. It had been days since Zariah stepped back into the art room. The walls, once vibrant with student projects, now felt unfamiliar. But when she entered that afternoon, Miss Sanchez was already waiting, seated at a stool, a paintbrush in one hand, and a half-finished canvas in front of her. Zoraya hovered near, the doorway unsure. Miss Sanchez looked up and smiled, not the kind of smile that pushed past discomfort, the kind that said, "I see you." "I was hoping you'd stop by," she said, setting the brush down. Zoraya didn't speak. Her eyes darted to the blank sketchbook clutched in her arms, then back, to the floor. Ms. Sanchez walked over, her steps slow and gentle. "You probably don't know this, but when I was your age, I had an accent so thick I used to pretend I'd lost my voice in public." Zoraya glanced up, surprised. Ms. Sanchez chuckled lightly. "I hated my voice, my curls. Everything about me that made people ask, 'Where are you from?' No, really?" Zoraya's lips parted, but no words came. "I don't say this to compare stories," Ms. Sanchez added. "Only to tell you, I know what it means to feel like your body speaks before your mouth does, to feel like the world already wrote your story without asking you for a single word." She reached into her desk and pulled out a box of mixed media. Materials: chalk, charcoal, torn fabrics, acrylics. "Let's rewrite the story, one piece at a time." Zoraya returned the next day, and the day after. Each time, the sketchbook pages filled a little more. At first, her strokes were hesitant, light pencil outlines, fragmented shapes, but soon color exploded across the paper. Reds for the anger she'd buried, blues for the sadness that clung to her spine, golds for the hope she wasn't sure she was allowed to feel again. She called it Crowned. The series began with a jagged portrait, her face cracked down the middle, one eye hidden, the other wide and terrified. The next showed a silhouette, surrounded by storm clouds. Another featured a pair of scissors melting into roots being swallowed by the earth. Each piece told a truth she hadn't known how to say. Ms. Sanchez hung the first one up on the classroom wall. Then the second. Soon the art room was transformed, walls lined with Zoraya's story, told in texture and color. When Harper passed by and peeked through the window, she paused. She didn't laugh. She didn't smirk. She just stood there, staring. Zoraya noticed but didn't flinch. She didn't make this art for Harper, or for Madison. She made it for the girl who had sat on the bathroom floor and questioned if she was worth anything at all. She made it for herself. One afternoon, Ms. Sanchez approached her with an idea. "Would you ever consider posting these?" Zoraya hesitated. "Online?" Ms. Sanchez nodded. "You don't have to, but sometimes in sharing truth invites others to speak theirs." Zoraya looked down at the latest piece. A woman standing tall, locks like flames reaching toward the sky. A tiny golden crown floated just above her head. She thought of all the things they had taken from her. Her peace, her silence, her hair. But they hadn't taken her truth. That night, she took a photo of the collection. Her hands shook as she typed the caption. "They cut my locks to shame me, but my roots run deeper than their scissors." She clicked post and closed the app. She didn't expect anything, maybe a few likes, maybe some kind words from Ms. Sanchez or a friend of her mom's, but by morning her phone had exploded. Hundreds of shares, thousands of likes. The comments were overflowing. "My daughter needed this. Thank you. You don't know me, but you just gave me the courage to wear my hair natural again. You are everything they fear and everything we celebrate." It didn't stop. Beauty brands reposted the art. Hair care companies offered to send gifts. Journalists reached out. Influencers with millions of followers stitched her words into their own stories. Zoraya sat on her bed, stunned. Not because people were watching, but because they finally saw her. It wasn't just the attention. It was the connection. Black women from New York to Nairobi commented on her post. Teenagers tagged their friends. Grandmothers wrote long paragraphs about the first time they were told their hair was unprofessional. Mothers uploaded pictures of their daughters in braids, puffs, and twists with captions like "Crowned just like you." Zoraya scrolled through them one by one, her eyes wide, heart full. For every insult she'd once endured in silence, there were now 100 voices rising beside her. Her mother peeked into her room and saw the screen glowing. "You all right?" she asked gently. Zariah nodded. Yeah, I think I am. Her grandmother walked in behind her, holding the phone she barely knew how to use. Someone just sent me a link to a blog post, she said. You're on it. Zariah smiled for the first time in weeks. I know. It was overwhelming, beautiful, a little terrifying. But most of all, it was affirming. In a world that once made her feel invisible, Zariah had become a mirror to millions. She wasn't just healing. She was helping others heal too. The school couldn't ignore it anymore. The local news station ran a story. Teen artist reclaims power after school hair incident. They reached out to the school for comment. Principal Rowley released a vague statement about diversity training and regretful incidents. But Zariah didn't care about their carefully worded apologies anymore. The power had shifted. She was invited to speak on a panel about youth activism. At first, she said no. The idea of standing in front of strangers made her stomach churn. But her mother sat beside her that night and said, You don't have to be loud. Just be real. That's enough. So she agreed. At the event, her voice shook at first. She read from her journal, shared parts of her journey, talked about Crowned. The audience was silent, but not the heavy silence she remembered from class. This one was full of listening. Afterward, a girl with short twists and tear-filled eyes hugged her tight and whispered, You told my story. Zariah held her close, because she understood. And that understanding, that shared knowing, was everything. One evening, Zariah returned to the art room alone. Ms. Sanchez had left the door unlocked for her, as always. The air smelled of turpentine and chalk. Her paintings still lined the back wall, but now there were others too. Works by classmates, who had been too afraid to speak before. A boy had painted a clenched fist surrounded by microphones. A girl had drawn her hijab made of constellations. Zariah walked slowly past them, her fingers brushing the edges of their canvases. It wasn't just her anymore. Back at her corner desk, she pulled out a new canvas. She didn't sketch first. She just painted. Bold colors, sweeping lines, no apologies. Her strokes were confident now. When she finished, she stood back and looked at it. It was a portrait of herself. Not cracked, not broken, just standing. The lock that had been cut was still gone in the image. But instead of shame, there was strength in the space where it once was. Because now she understood. That space had made room for something else. Something unstoppable. Later that week, Zariah visited a local community center with her mother. They'd been invited to a small gathering for young girls, many of whom wore their hair in twists, puffs, or locks. As soon as Zariah entered the room, eyes lit up. The girls ran to her, not with caution but with joy. You're the art girl. One of them squealed. Another held up her phone, showing a screenshot of Zariah's post. You made me want to wear my hair out for picture day. Zariah knelt down and smiled. It looks beautiful on you. They spent the afternoon drawing together. Each girl was asked to create a power portrait, an image of themselves at their most confident. Zariah moved from table to table, offering encouragement, sharing ideas, and laughing in a way she hadn't in months. One girl whispered shyly, Do you think I could be like you one day? Zariah took her hand gently. You already are. That night, in the car ride home, her mother glanced at her and said, You've become the woman we always prayed you'd meet. Zariah looked out the window, heart full. She was still growing, but she was no longer hiding. The attention didn't stop. National outlets began calling. A major magazine requested an interview. A well-known artist invited her to collaborate on a gallery project titled Roots. At school, even the students who had once ignored her now stopped in the halls with awkward admiration. But Zariah didn't let it sweep her away. She still made time for her journal, still swept the art room floor after class, still paused to check in on classmates who had once sat silently beside her. She remembered the girl in the mirror, the one who almost cut it all off. She promised never to forget her. One afternoon, Harper approached her by the lockers. She didn't say much. Just, I saw your work. It made me think. Zariah didn't reply with words. She nodded, then walked past. Some bridges weren't meant to be rebuilt, but growth didn't always need applause. Later that night, she stood in front of her canvas again, a blank one, not because she had run out of stories, but because new ones were just beginning. On the anniversary of the incident, Zariah hosted a small showcase in the school auditorium. She called it Rooted. It featured not only her own pieces but works from students across the district. Voices that had felt silenced now had space to be loud, raw, and real. Paintings, poems, dance, music. Even a short film made by a girl who'd never spoken in front of a crowd before. Zariah stood at the back of the room watching it all unfold. Teachers walked by, eyes wide with quiet awe. Parents wiped away tears. Younger students stared with wonder. She felt no need to take the stage. Her presence was already in every corner. Ms. Sanchez found her as the lights dimmed. "You've done something that can't be undone," she said. "You've given permission." Zariah nodded. "I think I just needed it first." Later, as she packed up her final canvas, a younger girl approached her. No more than 11, her locks tied with yellow ribbon. "Can I hug you?" she asked. Zariah bent down and opened her arms. The girl squeezed tight. "I want to be brave like you." Zariah whispered back, "You already are." That night, back home, she wrote one last entry in her journal. "I used to think they took something from me, but the truth is, I found something in myself they never even saw coming." And with that, she closed the journal, then opened a new one. Because her story wasn't over. It was just getting started. A week later, her artwork was displayed at the city's cultural center under a new exhibit titled Young Voices Rising. Families came in waves, teachers brought classes, and strangers left handwritten notes in the guest book. One note read, "Thank you for telling the story I was too afraid to speak." Another simply said, "You helped me love myself." As Zariah stood in front of her portrait, the one with the missing lock and the golden crown hovering just above, it struck her that healing wasn't just about forgetting pain. It was about planting something stronger where it once lived. She touched her hair, smiled, and turned toward the next blank canvas. This time, with no fear, only fire and truth, and a crown no one could take. She walked away from her past and toward her power, with no apology, unapologetically. Zariah sat at the kitchen table, the edge of her paper trembling in her hands. She'd been asked to speak at the next school board meeting, publicly. Not a private conversation, not an email, a microphone, a room full of parents, cameras, and silence waiting to be filled. Her mother slid a warm mug of tea beside her. "You don't have to do this," she said gently. Zariah looked up. "But if I don't, who will?" Her grandmother stood behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Tell the truth, baby, the whole of it, and let them decide if they're brave enough to hear it." When the night came, she wore her school uniform, the same one they said. She wore too proudly, but this time she added a pin on the collar, a tiny gold crown. They walked into the building together, Zariah, her mother, and her grandmother. 3 generations, 3 different fights. One voice, the auditorium was packed. Teachers, students, board members in suits. Zariah could feel the stares, the tension, the whispers. But she stepped up to the mic anyway. Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. "My name is Zariah Monroe," she began, eyes fixed on the board. "I'm 16 years old, and I'm here tonight because silence nearly convinced me I didn't matter." The room hushed. I was humiliated in a classroom. My hair, something I wear with pride, something tied to my identity and culture, was cut without my permission in front of my peers. And when I ran out of that room, no one followed. Murmurs rose, a few parents shifted uncomfortably. I waited for someone to say it mattered. I waited for my teacher to report it. I waited for my principal to take action. But what I got was silence. And that silence was louder than the scissors. She paused, her eyes scanning the board. It wasn't just about one moment. It was about everything that came after, and everything that came before. Zariah unfolded another paper, filled with notes, but she didn't read from it. She looked up instead. Do you know how many girls have been sent home from this school because their hair was deemed a distraction? I do. They wrote to me. Zariah stepped aside as another student approached the microphone. Then another, a boy named Jordan whose detentions doubled every time he wore his hoodie. A girl named Aaliyah, who'd been told her afro made it hard for kids to see the board. A soft-spoken junior who had been penalized for unprofessional braids during a school photo. One by one, they told their stories. No anger, just truth. The board members fidgeted. A few looked down at their notes. Others whispered among themselves. But the students didn't stop. A pattern was unfolding, and it was undeniable. Zariah sat beside her mother in the front row, listening as stories poured out like long-held storms. Her grandmother nodded quietly with every testimony. When Madison's mother stood to speak, her voice was loud and defensive. My daughter didn't mean harm. She's a child. This cancel culture is poisoning our schools. Are we really going to ruin her future over one mistake? Zariah didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't look away. Instead, when the board chair asked if she wanted to respond, she stood once more. I'm not here to ruin anyone, she said calmly. I'm here to rebuild what was torn. The room fell still again. I'm not asking for revenge. I'm asking for recognition, for accountability, for dignity, for every student who's ever felt like their heritage made them a problem to be solved. Applause broke out, slow at first, then swelling like a wave. The day after the board meeting, a journalist from a prominent national magazine published an article titled, Crowned, the Teen Artist Forcing Schools to Face the Truth, about hair and identity. The piece went viral within hours. Zariah's photo, standing at the podium, her golden crown pin glinting under fluorescent lights, circulated across platforms. News anchors debated school policies. Hashtags trended. Activists began organizing. Under a new banner, Nos crowned in schools. The article didn't just recount her story. It highlighted the deeper problem, the dress codes that disproportionately punished black students, the subtle grading disparities, the lack of cultural competency training. It became more than her moment. It became a mirror to a nation. Soon, after, she was contacted by a grassroots organization advocating for natural hair protection laws. They asked if she would lend her name and art to their new campaign. She didn't hesitate. Yes, she said. Absolutely yes. Posters featuring E. Her paintings began to appear in school hallways across the country. Your roots are not a violation. Crown yourself. Always. She wasn't just a student anymore. She had become a symbol, and her truth had become a movement. At Crestwood Academy, change came slowly. But it came. After the media spotlight, the school board initiated a formal review. Civil rights groups were invited to evaluate school policies. Dress codes were revised, vague phrases like distracting hairstyles removed completely. Teachers underwent mandatory bias and cultural competency training. A new student equity council was formed, and Zariah was asked to chair it. She politely declined. I'll support it, she said, but I want others to speak too. I've had my turn. Let's hear from the rest. Still, her presence lingered in every meeting, every new initiative, every poster in the halls. Madison no longer roamed the corridors like a queen bee. Some of her friends had distanced themselves. She walked quieter now. Zariah never gloated, never taunted her, never posted about her. She didn't need to, because justice wasn't about humiliation. It was about restoration. And Zariah had chosen to build something better in the space where her silence used to be. Something lasting. Something that could never be cut down again. Weeks passed. Then months. Zariah returned to the art room often, sometimes to paint, sometimes just to sit in the stillness. Her corner had become a small sanctuary, tucked between shelves and sunlit windows. New students came by, curious, nervous, hopeful. One girl, a freshman, quietly left a drawing on her desk. It was of a girl with braids standing on a mountaintop, the sun rising behind her. Zariah picked it up, heart swelling. Another time, a boy from her chemistry class stopped her in the hallway. "Thanks for what you said. My little sister saw your video. She wore her afro to school for the first time last week. My mom cried." Zariah nodded. "Tell her she's beautiful, every day." Not everything was perfect. There were still whispered comments. Some staff still tiptoed around hard conversations. But the silence no longer swallowed everything. People were talking, listening, questioning. And Zariah no longer felt alone when she walked through the front doors. She walked in with pride now, not for the attention, not for the praise, but for surviving, for choosing to stand. One afternoon, she received a letter with a golden seal. It was from the state legislature. They were preparing to introduce a bill mandating natural hair protection in public schools. The letter thanked her for her courage and invited her to speak at the announcement. Zariah read it 3 times before looking up at her mom. "Do I have to be a politician now?" Her mom laughed. "No, just be Zariah." So she did. At the Capitol, she stood beside lawmakers, educators, and advocates. She shared her story again, but this time with less fear, with more certainty, with more purpose. When the bill passed, she was back in the art room, alone. She looked at her first painting, the one where the Loc had been cut, and touched the edges. It no longer felt painful. It felt powerful. She added one final brushstroke to the canvas, a small golden crown in the corner, subtle but unmistakable. And just like that, the painting was done. Her past didn't need to be erased. It only needed to be seen. Truthfully, that evening Zariah sat on the porch with her grandmother, watching the sky turn pink and gold. "You changed things," her grandmother said softly. Zariah shook her head. "We changed things, I just showed up." Her grandmother smiled. "Baby, showing up is half the battle. But speaking up, that's where the power is." They sat in silence for a moment, the crickets filling the space. "Do you miss the old you?" her grandmother asked. Zariah thought about it. "No, I think she's still here, just stronger and louder." Her grandmother nodded. "Good, keep her close." Inside, her mother was on the phone with a community organizer, planning a district-wide summit on student equity. Zariah smiled to herself. This was no longer just her fight. It was a legacy, a relay. And she was ready to pass the baton when the time came, after carrying it just a little further. In the following months, new stories blossomed. A student-led campaign demanded the inclusion of Black authors in the English curriculum. Another petition to rename a hallway after a local civil rights leader. Even the morning announcements began, including cultural facts and student-led spotlights. Zariah watched it all unfold from the background. She didn't need to be at the center anymore. The change had taken root. During an assembly, a sophomore named Kira took the mic and spoke about her first suspension, how it started over her box braids and ended with her finding her voice. As the crowd clapped, Kira glanced toward Zariah and gave a small nod. Zariah returned it, her heart swelling. The crown was never meant to sit on one head alone. It was meant to be shared. It was meant to grow. And now, it was everywhere. College brochures began arriving in the mail, some from art schools, others from universities with social justice programs. Zariah browsed through them slowly, not with anxiety, but curiosity. She didn't have everything figured out, but she knew she wanted to keep creating, keep advocating, keep telling the stories that had too long been buried under silence and shame. One afternoon, she returned to the mural behind the school gym, the same wall students once walked past without a second glance. It had been approved for a student-led art project, and Zariah had been asked to help design it. She traced outlines, handed out paintbrushes, and offered quiet encouragement as others filled the wall with color. Flowers blooming from Locs, raised fists holding books, silhouettes of students, walking hand in hand across bridges. It wasn't her mural, it was theirs, and that made it perfect. As the final rays of sun stretched across the schoolyard, Zariah stepped back and smiled. This was the stand she had taken, not in anger, but in truth. And truth had changed everything. That night she sat on her bedroom floor, surrounded by candles and open sketchbooks. Her journal lay beside her, the cover soft and worn. She flipped to the last page and began to write. Some people think, "Strength is loud," she wrote. But I've learned it can be quiet. It can be steady. It can be a girl who once sat in silence and now paints the world in her voice. She closed the journal and looked at herself in the mirror. The uneven lock was still there, growing back slowly. She didn't plan to hide it. It had become a reminder of what was taken, of what she reclaimed, and of what would never be taken again. Her phone buzzed. A message from a younger student. "Thank you for standing up. I'm braver because of you." Zariah smiled. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she stood, stretched her arms wide, and walked toward the window. The night air was cool. The stars overhead shimmered quietly. The world was still full of noise, still full of fights, but she had learned something sacred. Sometimes the most powerful stand is simply choosing to stay standing, especially when no one expected you to. She didn't just reclaim her voice. She lit a path for others to follow, and, still rising, the invitations began arriving in waves, emails from advocacy groups, schools, even television networks. Everyone wanted to hear from the girl who turned pain into power. Zariah didn't accept every request. She chose carefully. But when she did say yes, she spoke with grace and fire. At a natural hair conference, she stood beneath stage lights, her locs tied back in a soft wrap, and shared her journey with stylists, mothers, daughters, and educators who nodded, cried, and clapped with every word. She visited middle schools where students waited in long lines just to hug her. She was featured in an online gallery titled Voices in Color, where her Crowned series hung alongside professional artists from across the globe. And yet, it was never the applause that filled her. Her biggest victory came each morning, quietly. She would wake up, walk to the mirror, and smile, not just at the reflection staring back, but at the woman emerging day by day. Her new locks were growing in soft, proud coils. The patch that had once been severed now sparkled with regrowth, with memory, with truth. At school, the air felt different now. New signs hung in hallways, messages of inclusion, celebration, and history. Teachers underwent training on cultural sensitivity. Assemblies included voices once ignored. The dress code that once punished. Texture and tradition had been rewritten. It no longer asked students to erase themselves to belong. Zariah didn't lead the changes anymore. She didn't need to. A freshman girl named Tamika had started a club for cultural inclusion. A boy named Evan asked the principal to carry books by Black authors in the library. The wave had grown beyond her reach, and that's how she knew it was real. The principal stopped her in the hallway one day. "We hired a full-time diversity consultant," she said, "and I wanted you to know. The board approved a student-led advisory committee. They want you to be the honorary advisor." Zariah smiled. "Only if you're ready for hard truths," the principal chuckled nervously. "I think we are." At home, she kept painting. She filled her room with canvases, portraits of girls with bold hair, boys with hopeful eyes, communities holding hands. Her brush no longer trembled. It danced. One quiet evening, Zariah sat at her desk, lit only by a soft lamp and the fading orange of the setting sun. Her journal lay open in front of her. This time she wasn't writing for a gallery or a speech or even herself. She was writing to the girl she used to be, to the girl who sat frozen in a classroom while her crown was cut, to the girl who hid her reflection behind towels and tears, to the girl who thought no one would ever understand. She dipped her pen and began. "Dear Zariah, I see you. I see the pain in your eyes, the questions you can't ask, the shame you carry for something that was never your fault. You will cry, you will ache, you will almost give up, but don't, because what they tried to cut was never the end of you. It was the beginning. You will rise, you will speak, You will stand so tall, others will see themselves in your strength, and your silence, so heavy now, will become the loudest truth they've ever heard. Tears filled her eyes, but she kept writing. The letter stayed in her journal, tucked between pages filled with brushstrokes and brave moments. But its words found their way into other places. In a classroom across town, a teacher read an excerpt to her students during Black History Month. At a city library, Zariah's artwork hung in a corner exhibit titled Resilience in Color, alongside letters from local teens who said her story changed how they saw themselves. Even at home, her little cousin, just 7 years old, stood in the mirror one morning, placed a paper crown on her head and grinned. "I'm wearing mine today," she declared proudly. Zariah bent down and adjusted it gently, then held it high. The world was still far from perfect, but it was shifting, not because one girl yelled loudest, but because she didn't stay quiet, because she turned wounds into windows, because she reminded others that they too were worthy of space, not someday, but now. Everywhere she went, she didn't have to speak to be heard. Her story was already echoing. One afternoon, Zariah returned to the classroom where it had all begun. The desks were the same. The windows still let in that sleepy afternoon light, but something was different. On the wall near the chalkboard, a framed poster hung, one of her early paintings from the Crown series. Beneath it, a plaque read, "This classroom once held silence. Now it holds truth." She stood there for a while, not angry, not broken, just full. As she turned to leave, a teacher passed by and paused. "Thank you," she said simply. Zariah nodded. "For what?" "For showing us how to listen." That night, as the stars stretched wide above her window, she opened a blank canvas. No pressure, no expectations, just breath, just beauty, just beginning again. And in the corner before the first brushstroke, she whispered the words that had carried her from pain to purpose. "My roots still thrive. My crown still rises." And then she painted. Not because she was perfect, but because she finally knew she was enough, fully, finally.